Good morning, community, and welcome back to another Keeping It Real with Dr. Nita podcast. I am your host, Dr. Nita Polite Wilson, C-Suite Trusted Advisor and Board Director, helping members of the C-Suite reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different. Today, on our Real Conversation from the C-Suite, I am so excited to have with me Mr. Dwayne Robertson. He is the Senior Manager of Diversity and Inclusion for the Young Presidents Organization, or YPO. And we first met when I was invited to speak there last year with a client of mine. We had a wonderful time. And since then, we've just been having some ongoing conversations that I felt were necessary to bring to you. Dwayne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Anita. It's a pleasure for us to continue some of the conversations we've been having previously. And I thank you again for inviting me on your podcast.
Of course. I'm going to start with you where I start with most of my guests. And I want you to interpret my favorite quote by Andy Stanley. Leadership is all about taking people on a journey. The challenge is that most of the time we are taking people to places we ourselves have never been. What do you think about that quote?
I think it's a very powerful quote and a very truthful quote. And I think it really speaks volumes about what leadership truly is. And I can speak about my personal leadership journey in relation to the quote, where I found that being a leader, being responsible for either managing or directing subordinates, or being responsible for a particular task or important projects, has always involved me stepping outside of my comfort zone. So I think we can talk about it in a literal sense, where there's this new direction that we're charting or this new place that we're going to that we've never been to. But I think even on the personal level for that particular leader, and also the individuals that they're helping to bring along in the process, they're being forced to step outside of their comfort zone. They're being forced to think outside of the box, and they're being forced to learn new skills or adapt new skills to be able to achieve that ultimate goal.
And when leaders are taking their folks down a path that they themselves had never been, how important is it for them to be authentic about that, about maybe some of the hesitations that they might have, or some of the inhibitions around, I'm not sure what I'm doing, team, but we'll figure it out together? How important is that for leaders to share with their folks?
I think that's very important. I think authenticity, from my personal experiences, not just being in a leadership position, but then also being led by others, I find that authenticity is very key to key to the overall process. One, in terms of relationship building. Two, building trust and making sure that whatever that particular leader is communicating, that their subordinates of the stakeholders that are involved believe that either that is the best thing to be done, or that that person's operating from a good faith. So I think authenticity is important. And I think it also creates a safe space, not only for that leader, but the other stakeholders involved, to truly work together to solve that particular issue or to accomplish that particular goal. I think if we're not willing to be authentic with ourselves and the stakeholders that are involved, there are missed opportunities to lean on the skill sets, experiences, and also the institutional knowledge that other people that are involved in the process can bring to the table.
Yeah.
But of course, if we're not operating in an authentic place where we know what we bring to the table, and just importantly, what we don't bring to the table, we're not creating space for other people to be truly involved and engaged.
That's right. That's right. And I've been thinking deeply about this for the past year, and I'm really working on an ebook that frames that into the thought of leading by unpacking. As a leader, your folks learn so much more if along the process you admit to, I don't know what I don't know in this area. Who around here can, kind of share in the leadership with that? And leadership back in, the good old days of the suits and ties, they were expected to have all the answers and never show any weakness. Well, it's intimidating to support a leader like that. It's unrealistic to have a leader like that. And then you're placing expectations on other people that you can't even live up to yourself. So I think when it comes to authenticity and the effectiveness of leadership, leading by unpacking is definitely the way to go. And some of the leaders that I respect the most in high positions are often the ones that say, I'm not sure about that. What does everybody else think? And as a leader, if you can do it all and don't need anybody else on the team, then what's the team there for? And don't think that they are not wondering, well, why am I here? So Dwayne, do me a favor, give us some highlights about your work specifically with YPO. I know that your background is diverse, varied, broad in terms of the work that you've done in the private and public sector organizations, strategies specific to public policy, diversity, and inclusion, and the integration of formative research and community relationship building. Tell us how your background and your skills play into the work that you do at YPO.
Excellent question. So, what I will do is I'll just give a brief synopsis on my professional history, some insight into what YPO is, which will then also set up the discussion around what I do as the head of YPO's Diversity Inclusion Office. To be quite honest, diversity inclusion is actually a second career for me. I originally went to school for public policy, both undergraduate and graduate degrees, with a concentration in health policy. And I started my career off working in government, first with the New York State Department of Health, then for the New York State Legislature. And those two opportunities really allowed me to understand the importance of how policy making, so not just legislation, but also budget making, really helps to shape the reality that we're in. And while I was working in government, my passion was really around addressing health disparities, basically the differences in morbidity and mortality, so sickness and also death rates that we see among different racial groups in regards to different health outcomes. And just having the opportunity to work in government, seeing the discussions, seeing how the stakeholders interact with each other, and just as importantly, seeing who had the most power and influence, not just politically, because this goes beyond politics. Many of us just thinks it's about the two political parties and whoever has more people in the legislature or whoever is the governor and so on and so forth. But no, power in itself is very complicated. Mm-hmm. It's not just the elected officials. It's not just the people who help to sponsor them or donate to them, but it's the interest groups and to a certain extent, also the voters as well. Their voices matter. And what I really began to realize is that through this dance that we see with these elected officials, interest groups, and concerned citizens, that's how policy was ultimately made. And I also got an opportunity to see what the responsibilities were of these different governmental agencies in terms of interpreting the policy and making decisions around how the money was ultimately spent.
I want to ask you a question. You just said something that really prompted me to think of something that happened out here in LA. You said power is complicated, and that is so true. And we're going to get into the importance of power structures and diversity efforts a little bit later in the conversation. But it brings to mind a situation here in LA where the city council, several of the Latino and Latina members were making derogatory comments about some of their constituents who were Black. And it was a big uproar. And while all of the commentators were doing their thing and making their analysis and sharing their observations, it occurred to me that we're dealing with human nature. And we always run the risk of whomever is in power is going to be corrupted by power. We've heard that saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What do you think about that, just in general terms? It could have been a panel of anybody making derogatory comments about someone else who's not in their group, and we would have had this same outcome.
I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think many times we don't realize that the people that we elect to represent us come from us. So that means that human nature is at play, and all the other isms and vices that comes with being a human are going to be represented within those elected officials and also the policymaking process. And I'm glad that you brought up that example about what happened with the LA City Council, because that speaks to the complexities of power and how it operates. Mm-hmm. These individuals, how they spoke, and I want everyone to understand here, I'm no way, shape, or form defending their behavior. I'm just trying to speak about it from a more, I would say, balanced perspective, as in the things that they said, those kind of conversations happen all the time.
All the time.
Only thing that made it, not made it bad, that brought it to the level of public discourse and awareness, is that these individuals were elected officials who had power to dictate policy and spending, mm-hmm. which again reinforces the fact that there are humans who are also looking at things from a tribal perspective.
Yes.
We all look at things from tribal perspective. Mm-hmm. Doesn't necessarily mean that we are innately biased. Doesn't necessarily innately mean that we won't treat people equally. But humans, there's a huge tribal element to how we operate and how we think and how we behave.
So let's take a look at that for a minute, because in the research that I've done and the training that I've had, if you've got a brain, you've got bias. Everybody has it. The question is, are you aware of it? And once you become aware of it, are you doing something to manage it? So let's put that out there on the table. So to your point, and to the point that we made earlier, it's likely that any group that's in power is going to have these kinds of conversations. That goes to what you mentioned about your background in health. And my question is, how much does mental health play into this conversation that we're having right now, in terms of the fact that we run the risk of anybody being in power getting carried away with power and making the kinds of comments that we've heard? What does that do to the mental state of those who are not in power?
That is an excellent question. And I think we can see, if we think about mental health on a societal level, we can see some of those outcomes and some of those perceptions. It's interesting. In celebration of Black History Month, I was just reflecting on some very influential first experiences of our Black people that were able to achieve the first in their particular field. And to answer your question, I thought about the husband and wife couple who did the Black Doll test. And the results of that was used to help influence the ultimate decision around Brown versus Board of Education. And even with the research that he did around the doll test, shown that young Black kids from ages of 3 or 4 are automatically at that point already believed that the white dolls were prettier, were better, and more acceptable than the Black dolls. I think that's a perfect example of that. Yes, that test did take place in the 1950s, but I think to the larger point about mental health, if you are one of these people that are on the outs, our society, not just in terms of the coded language, the images we might see, but even how your history, we're having discussions about what's acceptable in terms of America's history in the classroom nowadays. That can be a reflection to you that either you're on the outs or you're not perceived as important as other people.
I think the additional challenge that we face is not only is this happening in school, but it's something that throughout our developmental years into adulthood and in the workplace, it's just constantly reinforced without us realizing it. I'm hearing about conversations in the tech sector where we're even looking at changing the language from whitelist, meaning that's good, to blacklist, meaning that's bad. And when we think about just words in general, and we go look up some things in the dictionary, you look up white and it's all associated with good. You look up black and it's all associated with black. So no matter what we try to do in terms of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and valuing every voice, our everyday language says the opposite. And unless we're aware of that, how can we possibly begin to make any real meaningful progress? What do you think about that in terms of your work at YPO and how you are influencing organizations across the globe?
So that's an excellent segue. I appreciate that, Dr. Anita. And I think before I go into YPO, I just want to make a connection to the point that you made. So even when you were laying out the examples of language is also a reflection of a power dynamic, right? Mm-hmm. Because we can talk about it in terms of how anything that's associated with whiteness is good, anything that's associated with blackness is bad, but that comes from the paradigm of the people who created the system that we're under, right?
Absolutely.
And this is not saying anything bad, but we speak English, which is European language. So if we look at it from that perspective, of course, the language that's utilized is going to reinforce the self-esteem and the perceptions of the people who created it. Now, moving on to YPO. I think it's important to set the context of what YPO is. We are a global leadership community of extraordinary chief executives. So in other words, we are a peer-led organization, and it's very important for me to say that, of CEOs who are come together with a belief that by them meeting together and participating in YPO, they will collectively help to produce better leaders for our world and for our global society. And YPO, in order for someone to join YPO, they have to be the top chief executive of their particular organization. And there's specific criteria that they'll have to meet for membership. We are truly global. We have over 34,000 members in approximately 152 countries. And these 34,000 members are represented in over 400 different chapters. So when we talk about YPO, we are a truly global organization. Almost every language on this that's spoken in this world, you can find a member of YPO that speaks that.
Wow.
Now, in my role as Senior Director, Diversity Inclusion, I had YPO's Diversity Inclusion Office. Now, you're probably thinking, what does diversity inclusion look like in an organization that has 34,000 members in 152 different countries? The best way to answer that is that we are still working towards defining that. And I think that is a great journey that we are on as an organization. We have come a long way in terms of our diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, but we still recognize that we have a long way to go. And the reason why I also mentioned that we are a peer-led organization is that the great thing about the Diversity and Inclusion Office is that we have the opportunity to work with our members and help to motivate them and give them the resources and understanding for them to create change that will also help to influence their peers as well. So the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Office, we work with our peer leaders. We also work with our management associates as well to give them the understanding and also the best practices for them to also create impact. So in other words, I think the best way to describe the Diversity Inclusion Office is that we're essentially like a force multiplier when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
That's a good way to put it, a force multiplier. And throughout your meetings, you're always sharing best practices with one another, correct?
That is correct. So the Diversity and Inclusion Office has developed a suite of resources. We have what's known as a Diversity Inclusion Toolkit. We also have an inclusion survey that we encourage our chapters to utilize. And what we do is that in many cases, what we'll do is meet with the particular leaders in a chapter or region, help them, ask them to communicate the challenges or the issues that they're dealing with. And then we will serve more of a consultative manner where we will help them to better understand how they could utilize these best practices and how they could utilize resources. But just as important, these conversations also provide a feedback loop to the Diversity Inclusion Office. So it helps to inform of the future actions of the office, and then also helps to inform the future actions of the organization as a whole.
Fantastic. YPO, a force multiplier for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I love it. Community, we're going to have to pause the conversation right here with Mr. Dwayne Robertson, but please come back for our next conversation. We're going to talk about the concept of diversity washing and diversity fatigue and the relationship between the two. So you do not want to miss that. In the meantime, if you want to hear this podcast again or any of my previous podcasts, you know where to go. drnita.com. On the landing page in the center at the top, look for the link that says Keeping It Real with Dr. Nita podcast. Follow, like, share, give me some feedback. And if anything that we've said helps you to frame diversity conversations from difficult to different, please share with your network. Until next time, this is Dr. Nita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real.